This is Jeremiah from Indianapolis. I got to admit, I wasn't a very good student last night, and I didn't watch the State of the Union. I just couldn't stomach it. So I guess my question is, was it all pomp and circumstance mixed with Trump policy positions that could change arbitrarily at any time, or was there something you noticed as tangibly interesting, like verbiage that indicates a policy or messaging shift?
So, I mean, that is a good question, because most sensible people don't necessarily spend their time voluntarily watching State of the Union addresses. In fact, Ariel Edwards Levy, my old colleague at the Huffington Post, has done a ton of polling around this and finds that it's very heavily weighted towards the president's supporters who are watching the speech. And so then you get these polls afterwards that say X number of people who watched the speech, reacted favorably to it. But yeah, well, that's because, during the Obama time, it was the Obama backers who watched the speech. The Republicans are like, I can't deal with this. And so then when they polled people, they say, yeah, we like that speech. Last night, some huge portion of people said they loved the speech. If you missed it, so he delivered it in a very somber, slow, the best way to describe it would be mesmerizing. You were worried that he was about to fall asleep. He just read so painfully slowly from his teleprompter. He went about 40 some minutes before he really got into any policy at all. There wasn't much of that. He touched a little bit on immigration in the same breath that he said he was reaching out to make a deal. He called Dreamers illegal immigrants. And so he had a bunch of bellicose rhetoric around North Korea, as you might have seen. That could be the most consequential. Hopefully it won't be, but it certainly could be. The angle I took on my story on it last night was to say, look, yes, here are a lot of the things Trump said last night. For instance, he said, we're going to tackle the opioid epidemic. So I said, all right, what has Trump said before about the opioid epidemic? And he has said repeatedly that this is one of his highest priorities. In October, he declared a national emergency after stalling for a very long time on addressing it. And then last week, the national emergency expired. It was a 90-day emergency that he had declared, and he did effectively nothing during that entire 90 days. And so if you compare what he said last night and what he said over the campaign to what has actually happened, it allows you to pretty safely discount a lot of what he said last night, because it's very unlikely to happen. Now, some of the things will happen. He said he's going to keep Guantanamo open. Guantanamo was probably going to stay open anyway. President Obama had said he was going to close it, never managed to do so.
My first impression of the address was that we did dig a gigantic hole in the United States budget last December with the GOP's bill. And I feel like anyone who is a responsible adult would have addressed how we're going to pay for that in the address last night.
I kind of disagree, and here's why. Quickly read her question was, shouldn't Trump be talking about how we're going to pay for all this, since he just took this gaping hole out of the budget? And I think that you can and should condemn the GOP tax bill on its own terms, on the fact that it is a massive transfer of public wealth to the richest in the country and the richest in the world, not just rich Americans. It'll wind up in the hands of the rich all over the world. So it should be condemned on those terms. But on the specific terms of blowing a hole in the budget, I think that's where Democrats and liberals wind up getting tripped up, because there actually is no evidence that we're anywhere near the capacity of what the government is able to put into the economy right now. So there is a thinking out there that, if the deficit is at X or the national debt is at Y, then that's going to cause all sorts of problems, and it's going to put pain on our grandchildren's back, and it's going to lead to inflation. And the latter part is the only thing that you actually have to worry about, whether it will lead to inflation. And in fact, for decades now, we haven't come anywhere near even the inflation targets that we're trying to hit. Like right now, we have more of a deflationary problem almost. The Fed is trying to hit a certain inflation target, and they're under it, which means that the economy could still be pushed further ahead. And the way you do that is is by pumping kind of more dollars into the economy. These are dollars that the U.S. government creates. Congress can authorize them, and they get created. And then they put people to work. As long as there are people out of work, as long as the economy is not running at full steam, then it's fine to keep running the deficit up. In fact, every time in our history over the last 100 years when we have paid down the deficit, it has been followed by a recession. So there's this huge misunderstanding about the role of the deficit and the role of the debt, and a lot of it is tied up in people's kind of assumption that we're still operating under a gold standard. And even though people know we're not necessarily anymore under the gold standard, they still have this idea that there's a fixed amount of hard currency that the American people can move one way or another, and if the government isn't taking in enough money, then it's going to cause all kinds of problems. But the deficit is just an accounting figure. That's all it is. If the government has a deficit, that means the private sector has a surplus. That's actually tends to be good. Private sector has a surplus, there's more spending, there's more hiring. If the government has a surplus, which everybody seems to think is good, that means the private sector has a deficit. And that means they retract on their, they contract their spending, they contract their hiring, and it slows the economy. And so liberals who are making the charge that Trump is going to blow a hole in the budget and hurt the economy by the way he's approaching the tax cuts and by the way he would approach the infrastructure bill, aren't actually dealing with the way that the economics truly work. And as a result, when the economy doesn't slow down as a result, and when we don't get runaway inflation, they'll start looking bad. They'll start looking like, well, liberals must not have any, progressives must not have any idea how the economy works. Now, there is a camp within that progressive community known as modern monetary theorists. You can just look up MMT, and you can explain, and the reason they call it MMT, modern, is because we're talking post-gold standard era. We're not on the gold standard anymore, so we don't have to, we're not stuck to that. We can be more flexible in the way that we spend. And so, yes, perhaps Trump's tax cut has pumped so much extra government money into the economy that doing a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill will actually overheat the economy and will lead to inflation. Maybe, and that's something you watch for, and if it does, then you need to tax money back out of the economy to cool it off a little bit. But there's no indication that we're approaching that limit yet. And so the idea that you need to find a way to pay for it is one that both sides have really adopted in their rhetoric, but that Republicans ignore in their practice, and that is smart of them. And it jams Democrats up, because what Republicans want to spend money on are tax cuts. What Democrats want to spend money on, health care for people, social services, making more education, making college more affordable or free. And Republicans, in order to stop Democrats from doing that, say, well, you've got to pay for it. But that's actually not true. That's not how it works. It is not a pay for, unpaid for thing. These are American dollars that the American government creates, and as long as you're not seeing inflation, then that's the primary concern. The primary concern is how effective is the program. Second concern is, are you seeing inflation from it? The deficit is just an accounting number that is useful to know, but should not be driving policy. Y'all need to report on FEMA and Puerto Rico. So just recently, the FEMA announced that they were going to stop delivering water and food to Puerto Rico. They have since, in the last hour or so, backed off of that after an outcry. So what, are you crazy? This is not normal. People are still suffering there. So FEMA has turned the spigot back on, but it's obviously something we have to keep watching.